Hello and welcome to this presentation on India's partition, as explored through the everyday geographies of trauma. I begin with a brief historical overview of the partition of India, by way of context to Part 2, an illustration of its impact on the geographies of everyday life. And this illustration comes from two key novels that are set during the time of India's partition. British India, British colonial India, also known as the British Raj, ran from 1858 to 1947. Throughout this time, there were independent struggles to break from colonial rule. And amid a general British colonial policy that was a divide and rule policy of the population, a demand grew amongst some Indian political leaders for a divided India, a Muslim majority and a Hindu majority. What subsequently followed in August 1947 was the independence of India alongside the independence of a newly formed nation state of Pakistan. This involved the largest mass migration in the history of humankind, 10 million people, with tragically sectarian violence and mutual genocide between Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus, amounting to estimates range from 1 to 2 million deaths. As Professor Crispin Bates states, one explanation for the chaotic manner in which two independent nations came into being is the hurried nature of the British withdrawal. This was announced soon after the victory of the Labour Party in the British general election of July 1945, amid the realisation that the British state, devastated by war, could not afford to hold on to its overextended empire. These two maps show the partition. On the right-hand side, you see the separation off of territory that formed West and East Pakistan, and also the disputed to date territory of Kashmir. India prior to and post partition alongside Pakistan is made up of a number of territorial states, one of which, the Punjab, is significant here because it was situated on a new border of a divided India, and it became the microcosm in many respects of the partition. Both novels that I go on to discuss are set in the state of the Punjab. The Punjab, like India, would be divided in two. In their book, Nissid Hajari poignantly reveals the horrors of partition. And I read now a lengthy extract from Midnight's Furies, The Deadly Legacy of India's Partition. Nearly 70 years later, partition has become a byword for horror. Instead of joining hands at their twinned births, India and Pakistan would be engulfed by some of the worst sectarian massacres the modern world has ever seen. Non-Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus on the one side of a newly drawn border in the Punjab, and Muslims on the other descended with sword and spear and torch on the minorities that lived among them. An appalling slaughter ensued. Gangs of killers set whole villages aflame, hacking to death men and children and the aged while carrying off young women to be raped. British soldiers and journalists who had witnessed the Nazi death camps claimed partition's brutalities were worse. Pregnant women had their breasts cut off and babies hacked out of their bellies. Infants were found literally roasted on spits. Foot caravans of destitute refugees fleeing the violence stretched for 50 miles or more. As the peasants trudged wearily, mounted guerrillas charged out of the tall crops that lined the road and culled them like sheep. Special refugee trains, filled to bursting when they set out, suffered repeated ambushes along the way. All too often, they crossed the border in funereal silence, blood seeping from under their carriage doors. To the geographies of everyday trauma, which is captured incredibly well in the literature of two novels that are set during the time of partition: Train to Pakistan by Khushwant Singh and Cracking India by Bapsi Sidhwa. Train to Pakistan has as its setting the village of Manu Madra in the state of the Punjab, situated on the border of a newly drawn India and Pakistan. Manu Madra is a tiny place. It has only 3 brick buildings, one of which is the home of the moneylender Lala Ram Lal. The other 2 are the Sikh temple and the mosque. Although Manu Madra is said to be on the banks of the Sutlej River, it's actually half a mile away from it. In India, villages cannot afford to be too close to the banks of the rivers. Rivers can change their moods with the seasons and alter their courses without warning. The Sutlej is the largest river in the Punjab. Manu Madra has always been known for its railway station. Since the bridge has only one track, the station has several sidings where less important trains can wait to make way for the most important. Here is the modest geographical stage, and it's through Singh's character development on this stage that the surreal nature of a gradually transpiring barbarity of India's partition, at first so remote and abstract and then all too close and personal, is portrayed at its most human and inhuman everyday level. The following passage includes Iqbal, a central character, an outsider and a left-wing political agitator who's travelled the world, and he arrives in Manu Madra just before the violence of partition reaches the village. And he has an early exchange with Meet Singh, the head of the village Gurdwara or Sikh temple. Everyone is welcome to his religion. Here next door is a Muslim mosque. When I pray to my guru, Uncle Imam Bash calls to Allah. How many religions do they have in Europe? They're all Christians of one kind or another. They do not quarrel about their religions as we do here. They don't really bother very much about religion. So I have heard, said Meet Singh ponderously. That is why they have no morals. The sahibs and their wives go about with other sahibs and their wives. That's not good, is it? Here you have 2 clashing imaginative geographies of the world. Iqbal holds a secular Europe as progress, whereas Meet Singh holds a secular Europe as the opposite of progress. The exchange continues. But they do not tell lies like we do, and they are not corrupt and dishonest as so many of us are, answered Iqbal. He got out his tin opener and opened a tin of sardines. He spread the fish on a biscuit and continued to talk while he ate. Morality, Meet Singh Ji, is a matter of money. Poor people cannot afford to have morals, so they have religion. For Iqbal, with economic progress comes progress from the constraints that he sees comes from religion. Shortly after, Iqbal meets some more villagers. Well, Babaji, Iqbal, began the Muslim, tell us something. What's happening in the world? What is all this about Pakistan and Hindustan? We live in this little village and know nothing, the Labada put it. Babaji, tell us, why did the English leave? Iqbal didn't know how to answer such simple questions like these. Independence meant little to nothing to these people. They did not even realise that it was a step forward and that all they needed to do was to take the next step and turn the make-believe political freedom into a real economic one. Clearly, Iqbal is frustrated by what he considers the village simpletons, but actually, given the geographical time and context, a remote village in the Punjab had very little access to knowing what was going on in the wider world. And so while Iqbal is frustrated by this exchange, the exchange also takes a very interesting turn. Iqbal tried to take the offensive. Why don't you people want to be free? Do you want to remain slaves all your lives? After a long silence, the Labada answers, freedom must be a good thing, but what will we get out of it? Educated people like you, Babu Sahib, will get the jobs the English had. Will we get more lands or more buffaloes? No, the Muslim said. Freedom is for the educated people who fought for it. We were slaves of the English, and now we will be slaves of the educated Indians or the Pakistanis. The ultimate truth of this exchange is that Iqbal's notion of the villagers as simpletons is turned on its head, as they actually prove themselves to be politically astute, understanding independence as the replacement of one ruling class by another ruling class, and actually meaning very little in terms of their own everyday lives. Iqbal starts in this novel with big political ideas and belief in his own ability to alter the course of history. And as the violence of partition transpires, he ends up through the trauma of this violence in a state of despondency and giving up, ultimately, his fight and belief in progress. In the closing narration of Train to Pakistan, the seeming hero, Iqbal, becomes the anti-hero, and another character, the anti-hero, becomes the hero. For Iqbal, India is constipated with a lot of humbug. Take religion. For the Hindu, it means little besides caste and cow protection. For the Muslim, circumcision and kosher meat. For the Sikh, long hair and hatred of the Muslim. For the Christian, Hinduism with a solar topi. For the Parsi, fire worship and feeding vultures. Ethics, which should be the kernel of a religious code, has been carefully removed. If you look at things as they are, Iqbal told himself, there does not seem to be a code either of man or of God on which one can pattern one's conduct. Wrong triumphs over right as much as right over wrong. Sometimes its triumphs are greater. What happens ultimately, you do not know. In such circumstances, what can you do but cultivate an utter indifference to all values? Nothing matters. Nothing whatever. Bapsi Sidhwar's novel Cracking India is, in many respects, I find an even more powerful read and depiction of the everyday geographies of trauma during partition. During India's partition, the kidnapping, rape, disfigurement and dismemberment of women was a widespread occurrence. Those who survived became known as fallen women and were burdened by shame and were disowned by their families. It's through Bapsi Sidhwar's central character of Aya, a nanny, and the ice candy man, as seen through the book's narrator, a young girl called Lenny, that such horror is very startlingly depicted. And it's through the feminism and strength of Lenny's godmother that one finds some hope. So again then, as I proceed to read the extracts, the book's narrator is a young girl called Lenny. So the book starts with Lenny's mental map, her geography. My world is compressed. Warris Road, lined with rain gutters, lies between Queen's Road and Jail Road, both wide, clean, orderly streets at the affluent fringes of Lahore. What's interesting about this book is there is a dialectic, the swing between Lenny's childhood naivety and her maturing wisdom that gives the book's narration a hauntingly beautiful and authentic feel to the partition that took place in Lahore. Lahore being a city that fell ultimately on the Pakistan side of the Punjab. There is much disturbing talk. India is going to be broken. Can one break a country? What happens if they break it where our house is? Or crack it further up on Warris Road? How will I ever get to Godmother's then? It is sudden. One day everyone is themselves, and the next day they are Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian. People shrink, dwindling into symbols. Aya, my nanny, is no longer just my all-encompassing Aya. She is also a token, a Hindu. A Hindu on the wrong side of the border. Lenny's Warris Road, the place that was her sanctuary of play, becomes transformed during this period. Processions are becoming a part of the street scene. Addie and I slip past the attention of our vigilantes and join the tiny tin pot processions that are sprawled on Waris Road. We shout ourselves hoarse, crying, "Jai Hind, Jai Hind! Long live India, long live India!" Or "Pakistan Zindabad, long live Pakistan," depending on the whim or the allegiance of the principal crier. Even at this point, poor Lenny has little to no idea of the barbarism that is about to be unleashed and her own accidental role in this for her beloved nanny, Aya. Bapsi Sidhwar's Cracking India became a film by Deepa Mehta known as Earth, and I highly recommend that you read the novel and also watch the film, because it's through these fictive geographies that we get a genuine and fruitful insight into the horrors that were India's partition and the everyday geographies of trauma. Okay, I'm going to close the presentation here. Thank you very much for listening. Take care and stay safe.